If you've seen a movie in the last 10 years, you've noticed that there's a lot of CGI. For example, this is the avatar that you see on the big screen. And this is the avatar that actors and directors see. This begs an important question. How do actors act with CGI? The answer, it turns out, is with difficulty. In the theater or in old movies, you worked opposite someone and in a physically representative environment. That means if the movie took place in the desert, you were in the desert. A lot of human interaction is based on body language and what's going on around us. When acting opposite someone, you could see their reaction and react to that, or something could be going on around you and you could react to that. But how do you react to this? The humble tennis ball, perhaps the most in-demand actor of our time. Tennis balls serve as stand-ins for things that need to be CGI'd into a movie in post-production. It could be a monster, a creature, or even another person. Tennis balls are used because they're so versatile and easily acquired, and they give actors something to look at when acting. But how do you act with or against a tennis ball? After all, it doesn't think, it doesn't move, it doesn't act or react, it's just there. In this situation, actors need to reach deep within themselves and do the job of two people. First, they need to imagine what they're going to be acting against. It could be another actor that isn't on set, a dinosaur or other creature, a situation like an explosion, or something else entirely. After they've imagined it, then they need to act against it as though it were something real and happening then and there. These two steps need to happen at the same time, otherwise you do risk breaking the illusion that you have in your mind. Other YouTubers have done a great job highlighting at how CGI can help and hurt a movie, and I've linked to those videos in the description. But I want to take a more holistic look at this issue. Specifically, I want to look at two things. The first is how CGI can affect acting and how actors cope with it. The second is when CGI should and should not be used, as well as what makes for good and bad CGI. But first, it might be useful to understand why CGI exists at all. CGI stands for Computer Generated Imagery. At the risk of stating the obvious, that means that a significant part of the image or video was generated by a computer. That could mean a wholly digital recreation, like the water tentacle used in 1989's The Abyss, or it could be something caught via motion capture, like Andy Serkis's Gollum in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It could also be something as simple or as subtle as adding sound effects or removing wires. The use of computers is important in this case as it separates it from SFX or special effects, which are done live and captured with a camera. This includes things like smoke, rain, fire, pyrotechnics, blood, and more. In other words, special effects in some cases are what we call practical effects. With practical effects, the physics of a scene are about as real as you could hope for them to be, even though it was achieved through artificial means. The truck flip scene in The Dark Knight is a practical effect, though, to be fair, some CGI was required to remove the RAM that they used to get the effect. Still, it's constrained by the physics of the real world because the flip takes place in the real world. Both SFX and CGI are a kind of VFX, or visual effect, whose sole purpose is to give viewers the illusion of reality. The more seamless it is, the better. The more you notice it within the context, the worse. We all know dinosaurs don't exist in the real world, but we're alright with their depiction in Jurassic Park because it matches the idea we have of them now. In context, they feel real. Jurassic Park, still considered one of the best movies ever made, was also one of the first to do a phenomenal job merging the two. It used animatronics for dinosaurs like the T-Rex and CGI for dinosaurs like the Brachiosaurus, while close-ups were done with animatronics. That's the crux of any kind of effect, knowing how and when to use it. Like any technology, CGI started off extremely expensive but has come down in price with each passing year as computing power got cheaper and more powerful. The technology and its uses are ubiquitous. YouTuber The Movie Rabbit Hole has a wonderful series called No CGI is Really Just Invisible CGI, which highlights just how much CGI is used even when people rail against its use or wear its lack thereof as a badge of honor. Hint, there's a lot of CGI being used even when you don't notice it. And that's the thing, no one should feel bad about using CGI and no one should castigate someone else for using it. It's not any less real than any other kind of movie magic, it's just a different type. The only reason older movies couldn't use CGI was because the technology either did not exist or was prohibitively expensive. CGI makes some parts of the process more convenient and lets you do things you otherwise couldn't. It is just another tool. CGI, its creators, and its uses are just one half of the story. The other half are the actors, the people that need to act opposite an invisible force. Keep in mind that you and I get the full product. We get the movie that, ostensibly, the director wants us to see. On set, it's a completely different story. The actors are surrounded by cameras, people holding boom mics, green and blue screens, dozens if not hundreds of people staring at them, giant hot lights shining on them, and so on. They're well aware that what they're creating is artifice, but they need to behave as though it's as real as their daily lives. There's a reason people can discern between what makes for good acting.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit.
And what makes for bad acting.
Bring the car around. We're going for a drive.
Sometimes it's because they're there for the paycheck, but other times it's just that the environment isn't right. But there are ways to provide a more conducive environment. In recent interviews, Dave Bautista described his experience working on Denis Villeneuve's Dune movies and Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Talking about Marvel, he said,
"But there were a lot of times on, the Marvel stuff where I had to perform with tennis balls, with a lot of green screen, a lot of imaginary, so really dependent. And this wasn't every film, it wasn't every experience I had, but a lot of the times it was."
Here, his experience is similar to what other actors have described or experienced. The tennis ball, though undoubtedly famous for always being on time and having a wonderful personality, is slightly less helpful when it comes to showing emotions or giving cues than most other actors. Bautista and others have to do a bit more of the imaginary lifting, while in an environment that doesn't seem particularly conducive to it. Dune, however, helps out a bit. Of it, he said,
"And with Dune, it's just the world's been created for us, a lot of practical sets. And so it wasn't that I had to depend so much on my imagination. It made it very easy for me, made it very real for me with practical sets and incredible actors. And so I didn't have to act with CGI characters."
Having the world be created for him made the acting a lot easier, and having other actors to act against also made it a lot easier, as opposed to acting against a tennis ball. With this little bit of help, Bautista and other actors are able to get into the flow of their scenes a little more. The use of practical sets is helpful for Bautista, who also said,
"Everything you see in your immediate surroundings with this film is practical, because it allows you to just be completely immersed and you don't have to depend on your imagination. Everything is just there for you. It just allows you to actually just be in that moment and get lost in those scenes."
And that's the thing. Creating the world isn't the job of the actor. That's the job of the director, the writer, the designers, the artists, and others. The actor's job is to focus on their character and make sure it fits within the larger world. If the world only exists in the mind of the director and the people working on the effects, how can the actor be expected to give a good performance? This is especially true for the sci-fi and fantasy genres, where so much of the world will end up being digitally created. It's a dangerous thing for an actor to not fully understand what the director's intention is for the movie, as well as for their character. One way directors and studios can help is by creating the world the characters inhabit to the best of their abilities, instead of just foisting that upon the actors as well. In cases like this, CGI should be used more as a finishing touch as opposed to a crutch. Bautista isn't the only one that feels this way, though. One famous, or infamous if you prefer, story from The Hobbit is that Ian McKellen was annoyed by having to act by himself for large portions of it. If you've seen the movie, you're probably thinking, what do you mean by himself? What about all the dwarves and the Hobbit? Well, they were often on another set by themselves doing the same scene. Why? Well, Bilbo, Thorin, and company were half of Gandalf's size, and their heights needed to be digitally altered in post-production to get the right effect. Take this scene, for example. It's when Thorin and company have escaped the goblin caves under the Misty Mountains and are hiding in some trees to escape the wargs. In this behind-the-scenes outtake, you'll notice that Ian McKellen is playing Gandalf all by his lonesome, with Andy Serkis directing him, while the rest of the crew were, I imagine, filming the same scene elsewhere. The two scenes would then be put together in post-production, giving you the illusion that they were all on set at the same time.
It's the director and the people behind the camera who know exactly what they're doing and have planned for it over months, if not years, and the day comes to film it, and we just have to do what we're told, really.
You get a sense of the frustration that Ian McKellen feels in this scene, as he needs to perform a tenuous balancing act. First, he needs to be convincing, acting as though others are there in the scene with him. Second, he needs to be aware of where everyone else will be placed. When Andy Serkis tries to direct him about that, it ends up interfering with his acting process. It makes sense why. It's an unnatural way to act. McKellen, who won critical acclaim doing theater work for 20 years, is an actor's actor. For most of his life, he acted with and opposite other people. But thanks to the forward march of technology, he had to act by himself and imagine the other people. Still, he tried his best, recognizing that Serkis knew where the other characters would be and taking the directions as necessary. His experience on The Hobbit was different from what happened on The Lord of the Rings. Digital filmmaking was still in its infancy, and the entire trilogy was filmed on a pretty small budget compared to what an epic like that would cost now. When CGI wasn't available or might incur unnecessary cost, they got creative and used practical effects like forced perspective in order to show differences in scale. Consider the scene where Gandalf and Frodo are riding in his wagon. Where Frodo looks hobbit-sized to us, he's actually sitting far in the back. It gives the effect of him being smaller because he's further away. Similarly, by making some props or sets oversized, they were able to make the hobbits look smaller. However, forced perspective only works with the naked eye. Because The Hobbit also had to be prepared to be released in 3D, they had to do it digitally. In an interview with Popular Mechanics, Peter Jackson said, quote, "Once you shoot in 3D, it completely blows your cover. Your forced perspective tricks are naked to the audience. With 3D glasses on, they can see exactly how far away the characters are," end quote. CGI can also be helpful when it comes to actors though, as is the case with an actor who's right for the role, but perhaps no longer as mobile. Again, we turn to The Hobbit. Christopher Lee, the real, most interesting man in the world, was 93 when he did this movie and was unable to travel, so they came to him. A stand-in was used when they were filming the Rivendell scenes in New Zealand, while Lee shot his scenes at Pinewood Studios in England. With some movie magic, he was then added into the complete movie. In other cases, you could bring an actor back from the dead, as Lee's good friend Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin was in Rogue One. Whether or not that's ethical though, or a good idea even, is up for debate. So, when should CGI be used? Like I mentioned earlier, CGI is a tool. It's not good or bad, it just is. However, it can either be used well or be used poorly. A good example of good CGI is many of David Fincher's movies, which have more CGI than plenty of blockbusters. It's not used sparingly there. However, it is used to serve the film's narrative instead of just being there because it can be there. Captain Christian already made the best video on Fincher's use of CGI, and I've linked it in the description, but I'll point out a few salient details. Perhaps the most important part of using an effect is, as Christian points out, knowing when and how to use an effect effectively. The effect must have a purpose, not be used as a crutch. That means that if someone asks, "Why do you use an effect here?" you're able to provide an answer. Some good uses, as Christian notes, could be to provide a sense of space, as in Fight Club, to establish time and place, as in Zodiac, or to establish continuity, as in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, even for something as minute as hair. The first two don't seem subtle, and the last seems needless, but taken as a whole, they aid in the telling of the story and certainly don't detract from it. You might not even take it into consideration. Just like any tool, CGI can also be used poorly. That doesn't necessarily mean that the CGI itself looks bad, though that can be the case. For example, The Rock in The Mummy 2, Ryan Reynolds' mask in 2011's Green Lantern, and needing to use CGI to make Wesley Snipes open his eyes on Blade Trinity because he refused to do so, are all examples of CGI that could have been done better, though, to be fair, I don't really blame the post-production people on that last one. There's also something called the uncanny valley effect. It's the weird feeling that you get when something that's non-human, like a robot, is more and more approaching human likeness, but there's just something off about it. You might not even be able to say what the exact problem is. It's just a feeling that you get. A lot of people got this feeling when watching 2004's The Polar Express, an animated Christmas film. The actors donned motion capture suits and provided their likeness for the film, which caught some flack for how odd the characters looked. They were approaching human likeness, but some things, like the facial expressions, smoothness, or proportions, just did not sit right. When a character is obviously alien, like the Na'vi from Avatar, we don't experience this effect. They're humanoid, but not human. Sometimes though, even that can't save you, and you end up getting some unholy cross between feline and human, like the cats from Cats. Thankfully though, those are few and far between, sort of. Sometimes the issue isn't bad CGI, but bad stylistic choices, as was the case for the Speed Force scene in The Flash. CGI should immerse you in the movie and make you feel as though what you see could be happening. Improper stylizing can also take you right out of it. But worse than CGI done poorly is CGI done for no reason at all. Those are own goals that could have been avoided. In the end, the CGI might end up not fitting the scene or being totally superfluous. I'm prefacing this example by admitting that I like the Hobbit movies more than most people. They were fun to see with my friends. That said, the scene where Legolas is jumping on the heads of the dwarves as they head down the forest river in the barrels is completely unnecessary, and not just because Legolas isn't actually in The Hobbit, but because it doesn't do anything for the story or the narrative. It's meant to be played for cheap laughs, but I'm not sure it even accomplished that. It's wholly unnecessary, marred further by not looking particularly good. The entire sequence is, frankly, needless and doesn't do a good job at establishing space or distance. It just goes from water to barrel to dwarf to orc to elf until, mercifully, it eventually ends. Another use of poorly placed CGI is the baby in Breaking Dawn Part 2. This entire baby is CGI. I mean, come on, you couldn't get a real baby? Did this really need to be CGI? Granted, it's better than the puppet that they originally intended to include, but frankly, it would have been a better idea to just reshoot the scenes if you need to replace a whole person. If Ridley Scott can do that on a moment's notice for all the money in the world, a $40 million movie that became a $50 million movie because of replacing Kevin Spacey with Christopher Plummer, then the $136 million budget Breaking Dawn Part 2 can certainly afford it. In this case, it was a twofer. The CGI was approaching the uncanny valley, if not in it, and seems unnecessary because real babies do, in fact, exist and are able to play parts in movies. The list for unnecessary CGI goes on. Digitally removing Henry Cavill's mustache in Justice League, the kitesurfing scene in Die Another Day, the fake kiss between Jonah Hill and Lauren London in You People, the screaming goats in Thor Love and Thunder. Now, sometimes you do need to use CGI for whatever reason. And I'm not talking about MCU movies or sci-fi movies either, where the spectacle is sometimes the point. I'm talking about how, logistically, it would be impossible, improbable, or prohibitive to get the shots the way you'd want in any other way. The movie Rabbit Hole used the example of Barbie. Some practical sets were designed and built, but it would take too long and cost too much to build an entire city from scratch for half of a movie. So, you build the sets you actually need and fill the rest of it in with CGI. The CGI has a narrative purpose here. It's used to give the notion of an actual living world, which enhances the story and makes it feel more real. It serves a greater purpose. As I mentioned earlier, CGI has gotten cheaper and easier to use. Its use is already ubiquitous, but that's when creatives need to ask themselves whether or not they're using CGI as a crutch or if it's coming through in the clutch. Are they using CGI because it's necessary for the scene, or because it gives them more flexibility, or because it reduces costs, or because they have terrible time management skills and they really have no other choice? Flexibility and reducing costs are valid reasons, but should always be considered in the context of whether or not it adds to or detracts from the scene in question. Making the scene more flexible can be a good idea, but if it comes at the cost of an actor's performance, it might not be worth it. People are still going to the movies to see interesting stories with great characters play out, and the CGI is meant to support that, not take away from it. The worst reason for adding CGI is terrible planning, which is more attributable to the people in charge that set goals and deadlines. On any given movie, hundreds, if not thousands, of visual effects artists at different studios try to create a cohesive, coherent product. To do that, they need good direction. If the people making creative decisions don't know what they want and keep changing their minds while keeping deadlines strict in order to meet a release date, the most an artist can do is work with what they have in the time that they've got. As often as not, bad CGI is just bad planning on the part of decision makers. CGI is here to stay. It's too useful to get rid of it, and just like cameras, it's simply a tool. We shouldn't want to get rid of it either. Rather, the important thing is to find a happy medium. CGI is meant to support the film, the story, and the characters. It's not the be-all, end-all of a movie, nor should it be. Use it where it makes sense and supports the movie, and don't use it where it doesn't.